Hello, and thank you for joining us today. We will get underway with the webinar in just a couple minutes. Before that, I did want to direct your attention to the slide on the screen and make sure that you knew if you have dialed in on a phone for your audio option, you will not unfortunately be able to hear the first portion of our webinar. The workaround for that is if you do have a mobile device, you can download the app onto the GoToWebinar app onto your phone, and you will be able to hear the audio portion of the first part of our webinar through the app. If the only option for you to hear the webinar is by a dial-in phone, then you will be able to hear the second part of the webinar when we get into questions and answers. And also just wanted to note that a transcript and the recording will be available by August 11th. If you choose to not participate today because of this issue. Thank you so much. We'll get underway soon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Broadband Infrastructure Program webinar for this August. This will be the last webinar before the applications are due on August 17th. My name is Susanna Spellman, and I'm with NTIA's Broadband USA program. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to NTIA's Broadband USA program website. Today's webinar focuses on NTIA's Broadband Infrastructure Program and is the fifth of a many-part series. Before we begin, I would like to review the logistics for today's webinar. First, we will open up the webinar for questions after the completion of presentations. As you hear from each presenter, please use the question box on the right-hand side of the screen to submit your questions or comments. Second, the presentation along with the transcript and audio recording of today's session will be available on the Broadband USA website within 7 days of this webinar under the Events/Past Events tab. Finally, please visit our Broadband USA website for information about our technical assistance program, including useful guides, products, publications, and other tools that can assist you with planning, funding, and implementing your broadband project. We provide updated information, including our monthly newsletter and other broadband news. Our presenters today are Jennifer Dwayne, the Director of Grants for NTIA, Natalie Romano, a Grants Management Specialist within NTIA, and Catherine Bates, the Team Lead for the Broadband Infrastructure Program within NTIA. Our first speaker is Jennifer Dwayne. Jennifer is a Senior Broadband Program Specialist for NTIA's Broadband USA program, where she manages the office's grant programs and facilitates interagency coordination to support efforts to streamline federal permitting processes. Jennifer joined NTIA in 2009 to develop policy for the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, otherwise known as BTOP. She then served for 2 years as a senior attorney advisor at the Office of Chief Counsel for NTIA, providing legal advice to NTIA offices on a variety of telecommunications, information technology, and commercial data privacy matters. From 2012 to 2017, she served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary on matters related to broadband and public safety. Before joining NTIA, Jennifer served as a state regulatory attorney and then director of federal regulatory affairs for Sprint Corporation. She earned an undergraduate degree in economics from Penn State and a Juris Doctor degree from the George Washington University Law School. Our next speaker, Natalie Romano, is a member of NTIA's Office of Public Safety Communications, serving as the program director for the SLIGP 2.0 grant program, and is on a detail to OTIA to support the new broadband grant programs. Natalie has more than 15 years of experience in grant and program management and has a Master of Public Administration degree from George Mason University. Our last speaker is Catherine Bates. She is back with us after being on loan to the Treasury Department earlier this summer and spring, rejoining us as the team lead on the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Additionally, Catherine has worked with state and local governments to increase broadband access throughout the United States, focusing on unserved and underserved areas. Before coming to NTIA and the Broadband USA program, she worked with large library systems on the E-rate modernization effort at ICF International, a global consulting firm, where she focused on broadband funding, planning, training, and technical assistance. Prior to that work, she worked for a decade at a national association representing municipal interests, focusing her efforts on information technology, broadband policy, and community and economic development. Catherine received her bachelor's in business and master's of public administration from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. So real quickly, our agenda today is to go over the high-level programmatic aspects of the Broadband Infrastructure Program. That will be led by Jennifer. And then Natalie Romano will go through the application, including the pre-submission activities, how to complete the forms, how to submit, et cetera. And then Catherine will go through some of the FAQs that we've been getting over the last couple of months, and also provide information on where you can find links to new FAQs. And we'll again discuss some of the top FAQs that we've been getting. After that, we will open up for Q&A and taking questions from you that you provide in the chat during the presentation and in Q&A session. And now we turn the presentation over to Jennifer Dwayne.
Thanks, Susanna. I'm Jennifer Dwayne, Director of Grants for Ntia. And as I've done in the June and July webinars that we had on this program, I'm going to spend a few moments in this webinar highlighting some of the key definitions and requirements for the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Now, the Broadband Infrastructure Program is a grant program where Ntia has $288 million available to award to covered partnerships, and those are defined as a partnership between a state and one or more political subdivisions of a state and a fixed broadband service provider. Now, the covered partnerships are required to deploy covered broadband projects, and these are projects that are competitively and technologically neutral to deploy fixed broadband service that provides qualifying broadband service in an eligible service area. Ntia opened up the application window for this program on May 19th, 2021, with the release of its Notice of Funding Opportunity. The statute required us to give a 90-day application period to accept applications. So we will be accepting applications for this program through August 17th, 2021. Now, I just want to highlight a couple of key points and definitions for the program. The first is qualifying broadband service, and that is defined in the Act as the provision of broadband service that provides speeds of 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload, and latency that supports real-time interactive applications. In the NOFO, Ntia also added a few more clarifications to that definition. We indicated that the speed requirement of 25.3 means the ability to provide 25.3 simultaneously to every household in the eligible service area. And we defined latency to mean 95% or more of all peak period measurements of network round trip latency are at or below 100 milliseconds. The other definition that I want to emphasize is the definition of unserved. Now, unserved under the Act means a household lacks access to qualifying broadband service, which I just discussed, and no broadband provider has been selected to receive or is otherwise receiving federal or state funding subject to enforceable build-out commitments to deploy qualifying broadband service in the specific area where the household is located by date certain, even if such service is not yet available, provided that the federal or state agency providing the funding has not deemed the service provider to be in default of its build-out obligations under the applicable federal or state program. The next key point I want to emphasize on this slide goes to eligibility. Now, an eligible service area is defined under the Act as a census block in which broadband service is not available at one or more households or businesses in the census block. Now, to determine that eligibility, we'll be looking at the information that the FCC has provided in its maps, the FCC Form 477 data. And we'll also leverage NTIA's National Broadband Availability Map in determining what qualifies as an eligible service area, along with other data sources that we have in the map or that we have available to us. The eligibility also gets to the eligibility for this program, and that to be eligible to submit an application under this program, we need to understand who the covered partnership is, what the covered broadband project will be, and that includes the speeds at which the project will be, or at which broadband service will be offered, along with the cost of the project. That also means identifying the proposed service area for funding. And then there's also the requirement in the Act that the applicant, the covered partnership, identify any state or federal support that the fixed broadband service provider that is part of the covered partnership is receiving for the proposed service area that's identified in the application. Now, the NOFO also includes a lot of other requirements that are required to submit with your application. So I'll just, rather than go through them as part of this webinar, I'll just refer you to look at the NOFO for all the key requirements that of an application that has to be submitted for this program. And then the last point on this slide is the prioritization factors. Now, the Act identified several priorities or funding priorities, and NTIA is prioritizing the first funding priority that was identified in the Act, and that is to provide qualifying broadband service to the greatest number of households in a eligible service area. And we're going to be sequencing applications as they come in to identify those that are focused on this initial funding priority when we review applications for funding. The other priorities are focused on providing broadband service to areas that are more rural in nature. So the Act talks about looking at areas that include areas other than those that have 50,000 inhabitants. And that is just a prioritization factor. It's not an eligibility factor. So applicants that have areas that are including counties or other areas that do have a 50,000 more than 50,000 inhabitants are still eligible to apply. It's just they are not covered by this funding priority that's been identified in the Act. And then there's also the requirement that we look at projects that are the most effective, cost effective, and prioritizing those that are in rural areas. And then the final prioritization factor is the speed level. And we'll be looking at applications that propose broadband service providing speeds of 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second upload. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about eligible uses of funds. Now, grant funds may only be used to pay for allowable costs. And those are defined as costs that are reasonable, necessary, and appropriate, and allocable to the project. Costs may be direct or indirect. So direct costs are those that are directly traceable to the project. Indirect costs are more akin to overhead. An applicant that wants to include indirect costs in its project proposal must provide that as part of its budget. And they must have a DOC approved indirect cost rate or be applying for one, or just use the de minimis indirect cost of 10%. And this is all detailed in the NOFO sections on the application submission requirements. Now, the Act identified several eligible uses of funds, and these are also set forth in more detail in the NOFO. So the covered partnership may use grant funds to fund the cost of construction, improvement, and or the acquisition of facilities and equipment required to provide qualifying broadband service. And this includes infrastructure for backhaul, middle and last mile networks. And we tried to craft these eligible use categories fairly broadly to make sure that they can encompass as many activities that are necessary to deploy broadband infrastructure as possible. Another allowable cost is the cost of long-term leases. And these are for facilities that are required to provide qualifying broadband service. And this includes indivisible right of use IRU agreements. So we say the costs are that the terms can be greater than 1 year. But basically the applicant needs to provide payment for the cost of the lease during the award period of performance, which is 1 year, or or longer if you receive an extension by the Assistant Secretary. Also, cost of engineering design, permitting, and work related to the environmental and historical and cultural review process are allowable. In our July webinar, we went into more detail on the requirements associated with the environmental and historical and cultural reviews. So I would refer you back to those for some more detail on that, on what would be covered under environmental and historical and cultural reviews. Also, personnel costs, including salaries and fringe benefits for staff that are working on the project. These are all allowable costs. And so folks that are working as project managers, program directors, grant administrators, financial analysts that are working directly on the project may be paid for with grant funds under the program. We also allow for reasonable pre-application expenses or grant preparation and costs, but they may not exceed $50,000. And then there's, of course, the catch-all of allowable costs, which are necessary to carrying out the program activities of an award, but they do not include ineligible costs. So just as we have eligible costs, we also have ineligible costs. And there are two categories, one that applies to all members of the covered partnership, and one that applies to just the fixed broadband service providers that are part of the covered partnership. So with respect to the covered partnership, they may not use grant funds received under the program to purchase or support any covered communications equipment or services as defined in Section 9 of the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act of 2019. So basically, they may not procure equipment that may pose national security risk. Also, profits or fees and other incremental charges above actual costs are not allowable under the program. And then the covered partnership may not use grant funds directly or indirectly to support or oppose collective bargaining. Now, with respect to the provider of broadband service that is part of the covered partnership, they may not use funds to repay or make any other payment related to a loan that's made by any public or private lender. They also may not use funds as collateral for a loan made by any public or private lender. And they may not use more than $50,000 of the grant amounts to pay for the preparation of the grant. Also, they may not use funds for previously incurred administrative costs or previously purchased equipment or construction activities undertaken prior to the award. And then finally, costs may not be used to locate any funding from that the provider has received to deploy broadband service at locations that are used to meet an FCC Universal Service Fund deployment obligation. So as I mentioned before, we are accepting applications for this program. They must be by Grants.gov, and they must be received no later than 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 17th, 2021. So now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Natalie Romano, and she's going to go into a deeper dive on the application package that is required under the program, and looking at each of the standard forms that are required, and along with the budget narrative and detailed budget justification. She'll go into a bit more detail on that. And so the slides that I covered on eligible uses and ineligible uses will factor into that discussion, because when you're completing your budgets, you will need to make sure that they only contain costs that are eligible for funding under the program. So with that, I will turn this over to Natalie for her presentation on the application review materials. Over to you, Natalie.
Thanks, Jennifer. Today, I'm going to walk through several aspects of the Broadband Infrastructure Program application. While there are many steps in the federal grant process, today I'm going to focus on completing pre-application activities and submitting the application in grants.gov. While you're gathering your application materials, it is extremely important your organization has an active sam.gov registration. If your sam.gov registration is inactive, it may take up to 30 days to reactivate your account. You must have an active sam.gov registration to receive federal funding. In addition to sam.gov, you need to make sure you have access to Workspace in grants.gov for your entity. This will mean you need to have a username and a password. It could take several days to rectify grants.gov access issues, so be sure to check and make sure you have access to the system for your organization as soon as possible in case you need to make any changes. Lastly, to ensure you have a complete application, use the Content and Form of Application section in the NOFO to verify your application is complete before you submit it. Incomplete applications will not be accepted. This slide is pulled directly from page 26 of the NOFO and provides details on how to register in grants.gov. The biggest takeaway is that the state or political subdivision will need to have their active sam.gov registration and a DUNS number in order to register and apply in grants.gov. The Broadband Infrastructure Program will be using all of the standard form SF424 family for the application. All of the standard forms will be found on grants.gov. The standard forms that you will be required to complete are the SF424, SF424C, SF424D, and applicable lobbying forms. In addition to the standard forms, the Broadband Infrastructure Program requires specific programmatic and budgetary information as part of the application package, as seen in the right column. These forms will be created by you and are not standard or pre-created forms. The documents include a project narrative, a budget narrative and detailed budget justification, an indirect cost rate, if you're using one, letters of commitment, maps of the proposed service areas, pro forma financial information and analysis, and network diagrams and system diagrams. Now I will do an overview of some of the application documents. For the next several slides, I will walk you through the SF424, which is required with your application. Not all of the highlighted sections are required, and some of the non-highlighted sections are highly encouraged to be completed, so I will walk you through what sections to complete. In sections 1 and 2, you will indicate that your submission is an application and new. Section 3 will auto-populate when you submit your application in grants.gov, so you do not need to complete that field. You are also not required to complete fields 4, 5A, 5B, 6, or 7. The next section you will need to complete is section 8, which is the applicant information. The legal name you enter into the SF424 must match your sam.gov registration. Similarly, the EIN, organizational DUNS, and the address must also be associated with the legal name listed in your sam.gov registration. Section E is not required, but is recommended. It is recommended that the applicant complete the department name and/or the division name for the entity applying for the federal funds, especially if the applicant is the state. The next section that is required is section F, which is the name and contact information of the person involved in the application. Typically, this is the authorized representative. You will need to enter their name, title, phone number, and email address. The organizational affiliation field is optional, but recommended. In section 9, you will need to enter your eligibility status as your type of applicant. More information on eligible entities can be found in the NOFO on page 9. In section 10, you will complete the name of the federal agency as the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. You do not need to complete section 11, which is the CFDA number. In section 12, you'll complete the funding opportunity number information as the Broadband Infrastructure Program. This is found on the first page of the NOFO and in grants.gov. Section 13 is not required to be completed. Section 14 is not required, but is highly recommended to be completed if you will have multiple areas affected by the project. You can add a Word document or an Excel sheet if you have more than one area affected by the project. Section 15, you will enter a descriptive title for your project. Section 16 is required to be completed. You will enter the congressional districts for where your project will be located in sections A and B. You can attach a spreadsheet or a Word document if more congressional districts will be impacted by the project. If you do not know your congressional districts, please go to www.house.gov to search to find your congressional districts. The proposed start and end date should be listed as a one-year period of performance starting after November 29, 2021. Please be aware that only your official award document from NTIA will determine your period of performance. This that you enter will not be your period of performance. Section 18 is the funding section. In row A, you will enter the total federal amount that you are requesting. If you are providing a match, enter the match amount in the correct field, either B, C, D, or E, depending on where the funding will be coming from. Question 19 is required. This program is subject to Executive Order 12372. If your state has a designated intergovernmental review SPOC or SPOC, please indicate field A and complete when you sent your application over to that person for review. If your state does not have a designated intergovernmental review SPOC, you can select B and submit your application without state review. Please visit whitehouse.gov's Federal Financial Management page to see a list of the current state intergovernmental review SPOCs. Question 20 is required. If your entity is delinquent on any federal debt, you need to check yes and provide an attachment explaining the debt. Question 21 is also required. The list of certifications and assurances can be found in the SF 424D. The last section, the authorized representative information, must also be completed. You need to fill in the name, first name, last name, title, telephone number, and email address. The authorized representative must also sign and date the form. In addition to the SF 424, you must also submit the standard forms SF 424C and SF 424D. The next several slides, I will talk about the SF 424C. The SF 424C is one of 3 project budget documents you will need to submit with your application. You will submit this form along with a budget narrative and a budget detailed justification. The SF 424C is found on grants.gov. The budget narrative and detailed justification are not standard forms, so you will need to create these documents to submit with your application. In the SF 424C, you will complete columns A, total costs, B, costs not allowable for participation, and column C, total allowable costs. Column A is where you will input the total cost for your project by cost classification. This will include your federal funding requests, any match you will provide, and any other funds needed to complete your project. Column B is where you will input the amount of funding that is not allowable, but you are using to support this project. This could be other sources of federal funding, such as a federal grant or funding for activities that are not allowable under this program, but you plan on completing with outside funds. Column C is the total allowable cost for each cost classification, which is column A minus column B. When you submit your application, your budget narrative and budget detailed justification should mirror the SF 424C budget document. The budget narrative is typically a Word document where you give detail to each type of charge for your project. Typically, this detail includes a description of the activity or fee, the cost basis, the cost unit, the number of units, and the total cost. The budget detail justification is typically an Excel document showing the type of cost, quantity, unit cost, and total for each line item. If you will be providing match for the project, you will need to indicate this match on both the budget narrative and budget detail justification and clearly delineate what will be matching costs and what will be federally funded costs. I will quickly go through the cost classifications on the SF424C. Row 1 is for your administrative and legal expenses. Unlike the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, the Broadband Infrastructure Program does not have a cap or a maximum percentage of total charges for this cost classification. Some examples of administrative expenses include costs attributable to accounting, auditing, budgeting, and general ledger services, or facility occupancy costs like rent or utilities. Typically, your indirect costs will fall into this category. Row 2 is for charges for land, structures, right-of-way, appraisals, and other similar charges. This may include structures like a utility hut or a rights-of-way permit needed for construction activities. Row 3 is for relocation expenses and payments. This could include charges related to moving equipment from one building to another. Row 4 is for architectural and engineering fees. These fees could be for plans or designs to be developed. If you're not sure if the fee is specifically for architectural or engineering activities, you can list the other fees in row 5, which is other architectural and engineering fees. These fees could include testing fees for the network or equipment or field study fees. Row 6 is for any project inspection fees or fees directly related to project inspection. Any administrative or filing fees should be included in your administrative and legal expenses section, which is row 1. Row 7 is for site work costs. This could include costs for the site work, site preparation, or site utility work necessary for your project. Row 8 is for demolition and removal fees. Any environmental fees associated with the demolition should be included in the administrative and legal section, which is row 1. Row 9 is for construction costs. You should input all costs for the construction activities for your project, which will include taxes and any delivery fees. Row 10 is for equipment costs. These should be any costs for equipment for the project, but not for equipment components for the network that are associated with construction activities. If you have small office machinery, you can also put those costs in this row. Row 11 is for miscellaneous charges. If you have a charge that does not fit into any of the previous cost classifications, you can put it in this row. Be sure to give a detailed description of the cost so NTIA understands what you are planning on charging to the award. Row 13 is for contingencies. Contingency fees are not reimbursable by federal funds. Row 15 is for project or program income. If you believe you will have program income as defined by 2 CFR 200.307, you can enter the estimated amount here. Please remember that only program income during the period of performance should be indicated on this row. Row 16, column C, will be the total allowable cost for your project, which is inclusive of the federal charges and match contribution. Then in row 17, you will enter the percentage of the federal share for your project. If you're not providing a match, your project will be 100% federally funded, and therefore you will enter 100 on the line in row 17. If you're providing a 10% match, you will enter 90 into the row in line 17, and the federal share, because the federal share will be 90% of the total cost. After entering this percentage in row 17, column C should show the total federal assistance you will be requesting. This number should match the federal assistance number in your SF424. I would like to recap some of the important budget considerations for this program. You are not required to provide a match for this program. However, NTIA will favorably consider applications that propose to contribute a non-federal cost share or a match of at least 10% of the total eligible costs for a project. Your match may be either cash or in kind. No matter what type of match you propose, you must document your capacity to provide the match in your application. If you are providing the optional match for the program, be sure to account for this in your SF424 and the SF424C. As I mentioned before, column A of the SF424C will include all your costs for your project for each of the cost classifications. If you're planning on providing match, be sure to include this in column A along with your federal funding request. The Broadband Infrastructure Program does not have predefined percentages for the cost considerations. This means that NTIA does not require or have caps on how much can be budgeted for each cost consideration. This extends to the administrative and legal cost consideration. The Broadband Infrastructure Program does not have a ceiling amount or ceiling percentage on this category. Pre-application expenses are allowed under this program. However, they may not exceed $50,000. Allowable pre-application expenses include activities or expenses related to preparing an application between the publication date of the NOFO and prior to the date your award is issued by NTIA. Lobbying costs and contingency fees are not reimbursable by the program. In your application, you must clearly identify any pre-application costs in both your budget narrative and budget detail justification. Additionally, pre-application costs are incurred at the sole risk of the applicant and will not be reimbursed by NTIA if the proposed project does not receive a grant award. As I mentioned earlier, there are several non-standard forms that you must submit with your application package. The first is the project narrative. This is a 20-page, single-spaced document describing the key elements of your proposed project. The full requirements of the project narrative can be found beginning on page 13 of the NOFO. There are many different requirements and sections that must be addressed, so please follow the NOFO to ensure that you provide all the relevant and necessary data. The budget narrative and budget detail justification documents that I described earlier are also required with your application. Please be sure that your detailed spreadsheet can fit on letter-sized paper. If you're interested in charging indirect costs to the award, you will need to submit an indirect cost rate agreement from a cognizant federal agency. Each applicant must also submit a letter of commitment from an authorized representative from each member of the covered partnership. Additionally, maps, pro forma financial information, network diagram, systems diagram must also be submitted with your application. Now I will talk about submitting your application. The NOFO has specific requirements for the format of your non-standard application forms, such as the project narrative and budget narrative. More detail on your application format can be found on page 17 of the NOFO. You will need to submit your application through Workspace on grants.gov. Please be sure that you have an active SAM.gov registration prior to attempting to submit your application in grants.gov. Late or incomplete applications, as well as applications submitted by fax, email, mail, or courier service will not be accepted. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Catherine to discuss the program facts.
Thank you, Natalie. I really appreciate Natalie's willingness to help out on the broadband infrastructure team, as her knowledge of federal grants is vast. She's been a great resource for us. Now, I want to first talk about the exciting part. What happens after you turn in your application? There's a 3-step review process that NTIA will follow. First is the initial administrative and eligibility review of completed application packets. At this point, any applications submitted by anyone who is not an eligible applicant will be eliminated from further review. If there is missing or incomplete information from the applicant, we will notify them, and the applicant will have 7 calendar days to submit missing materials. If the applicant does not remedy these deficiencies in a timely manner, NTIA may deny the application. As stated in the NOFO, we will first sequence applications that address priority 1. This priority, which is proposing a covered broadband project that is designed to provide broadband service to the greatest number of households in an eligible area. These applications will then be evaluated against the objective criteria set forth in Section 5A of the NOFO to determine their further eligibility for award. To the extent that funding remains available after we complete the review of priority 1 applications, we will then review applications that address priority 2 and continue with this priority sequencing process until we have awarded all available funding. Then those applications will move to merit review. so the second box, where at least 2 objective reviewers with demonstrated expertise in broadband deployment will review and score the applications. The reviewers may be federal employees or not. During the review process, the reviewers may discuss the applications with each other, but will score the application from 0 to 100 on an individual basis. Applications scoring over 70 points will be considered qualified for funding. So after the merit review is complete, those applications that were scored as 70 or above and qualified for funding will move to programmatic review. In this review, NTIA program staff, such as myself, will use available data from the FCC as required in the Act to validate eligible service areas. The FCC Form 477 data is a data layer in NTIA's National Broadband Availability Map, NBAM, and we will rely on this data along with other data sets contained in the NBAM and any other available information to validate applicants' proposed service areas as meeting the Act's definition of an eligible service area. We will also provide a comprehensive review, ensuring that the application meets all objectives set out in the NOFO. At this point, NTIA staff may request supplemental documentation, and we will reevaluate the application package based on all of the available information presented. Applicants will have 10 calendar days to submit any additional information to NTIA. As you can see, the process is very thorough, and NTIA will be very busy this fall. Now on to the fun stuff. If you have a question, I bet NTIA website has the answer. We have been posting FAQs on our website on a fairly regular basis, trying to capture the most common questions we have received and even including some not so common ones. NTIA staff is happy to answer your questions, but I would recommend consulting our FAQs first before sending an email to us. If your question is not answered directly in the FAQs, I bet something close to it is in there and you can infer the answer. The FAQs are organized by category, including the categories listed on the slide: program overview, eligibility, other broadband funding programs, and eligible service areas, how to apply, evaluation of applications, grant award, and reporting requirements. Some common questions are listed here, and the answers can be found in the FAQs, such as what constitutes a covered partnership? Who's the lead applicant? How's the funding going to be handled? How will NTIA determine if an area is eligible? Are there any mapping requirements? Are the service areas that are to be served by non-wireline broadband services eligible for this program? Will we need to have an environmental review completed prior to submitting the application? Is minimum broadband speed based on advertised or actual speeds? If there are supply chain issues, can NTIA extend the period of performance? All of these questions and many more can be answered on the website. The easiest way to navigate the FAQs is to perform a keyword search, such as on environmental or FCC, unserved, latency, etc. Whatever you're looking for, just type in a keyword, and if the question is on there, it will pop up. If you can't find the answer, then contact Broadband USA at broadbandusa@ntia.gov. We will have another set of FAQs that will be posted very soon, and expect that we will have one more set posted a week before the application is due. So check the website regularly. And now I'll turn the webinar back over to Susanna to moderate the Q&A session for all those questions that are not found in the FAQs. Thank you for joining us today. And now I'll hand it to Susanna.
Hi, everyone. I'm waiting for everyone to come online. I've been going through a lot of the really great questions that you have been sending us. Thank you. Note that if, oh wait, a document just moved. Note if for some reason we don't get to your question, it's probably in large part because it has been answered in the FAQ. So definitely search those FAQs. We posted where you could find those FAQs on the chat box, or they're upcoming in FAQs, or for for maybe some of them, we don't know the answers yet, but we're going to take those questions back and include those in upcoming FAQs. So with that being said, I am going to jump right into it. So we have had a lot of questions about the state SPOC. I think one of the things, and I'm going to shoot this to Catherine, I think folks want to understand where they can understand whether or not their state has a SPOC and where that contact information is. I think I have a website that I can link,
Yes.
but if you could go ahead and take that question, I'll put that in the chat.
Sure. So Susanna's going to put the latest information we have, which is probably not the most up-to-date information we have. And I believe there's 15 states, 3 territories, and DC who have SPOCs. So if you are going to apply for federal funds and you're in one of these states, even if your application might cover more than one state, please contact them. But I'd also recommend anybody who's applying for this program to let their state, what we call state broadband leader, which is the people who manage broadband in your state, and we have contacts in every state for that. I would recommend that anybody applying contact their state broadband leader, which the information is on our website at broadbandusa.gov. Well, it's a longer website address, but on our website under resources, if you go to states and you click on your state, it'll come up with a name. And I would just, if you're going to apply, I would make sure that that person knows, in addition to the SPOC that you're that is mentioned in the application. So not every state has a SPOC, but every state does have a state broadband leader.
Thank you. And I am actually going in there and putting in that list to those state contact folks right there. Yes. Okay, Jennifer, we've had some questions about Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage requirements. Specifically, and there's a couple of sub questions to this, so bear with me. Is a broadband service provider that is partnering with a lead applicant required to comply with the Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements? The NOFO language makes it sound like complying with prevailing wage requirements is encouraged but not required. Will a project be rejected if the budget does not comply with those requirements?
Thanks, Susanna. That's a great question. So Davis-Bacon is not a requirement of this program. In order for Davis-Bacon to be a requirement, it would need to be specifically stated that way in our statute authorizing this program. It is not. We are encouraging compliance with Davis-Bacon and paying prevailing wages, but it's not a requirement. We have made it a selection factor, which means that we have the ability, if we have 2 similarly situated projects, that if one is paying prevailing wages and another is not, we could select that project ahead of a one that is not offering prevailing wages. But it's not a requirement, so it's not something that we would be rejecting out of hand if an applicant did not propose to pay Davis-Bacon prevailing wages.
So just to follow up on that, if a broadband provider is not required to pay the prevailing wage, which it sounds like that's the case, should the provider nevertheless factor the prevailing wage into its contingency costs, which is on field or line 13 on the SF424C?
I mean, if they're not paying the prevailing wage, then they wouldn't need to factor that in. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
So if you're not paying the prevailing wage, then you don't need to include it or factor it into your budget.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And then are the labor rates what the broadband provider will pay for labor to undertake the project required to be disclosed?
I mean, I think, we have in the detailed budget a spreadsheet and budget narrative. I mean, we want to understand, the details about the budget. So I think the more information that's provided, I think that's appropriate. Mia, do you have any insights in terms of that question?
Yeah, I think that's a great question there. I think, like Yashi mentioned, that the additional information that explains the cost in the budget narrative would be helpful for us to understand whether or not those costs are reasonable or necessary or allowable to the project. So, you know, obviously additional justification would help us understand what the cost is associated with and then whether or not it's programmatically allowable.
Thank you. And oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh, no, I was just going to agree with Ming that, you know, we basically, you know, at NTI, one of the things we need to review is to make sure that the costs are allowable. So the more detail that's provided in the detailed budget spreadsheet and the budget narrative to help us make that determination, you know, is desired for our review.
And I was amiss in not introducing Ming, who's joining us here from the NIST Grants Office. He is our partner from NIST who will be working to help us administer the grant. So thank you, Ming, for jumping in there. And I apologize for not introducing you earlier in the conversation.
No,
so
no problem. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. If there's grant questions, he's your man. So load him up. Okay, so following along with grants questions. So this had to do a little bit more with the budget. Specifically, and I think, Jennifer, what level of detail is NTIA looking for in a detailed budget justification and budget narrative? Are granular cost details needed for each category? For example, do applicants have to break out cost per foot of trenching? Or are high-level cost details sufficient, such as just providing the general trenching cost without providing distance and cost per foot?
I mean, as I said, I think we want to understand, I mean, the SF 424C is a very high level budget, and you're grouping all these costs into these, you know, very broad cost classifications. So the budget narrative, the detailed budget spreadsheet is your chance to break things out and let us know what exactly, you know, what costs are exactly going into those classifications, so we can compare them to the eligible uses in the NOFO to understand whether those costs are eligible. So again, the more detail you can provide, the better for us in reviewing those costs to ensure that they're necessary, reasonable, allowable, and allocable, which are the determinations that we need to make under the OMB cost principles to make sure that these costs are eligible under the grant program. So I would err on the more information, the better, for purposes of that determination.
Great, thank you. Catherine, we have a question about what should be included in the pro forma balance sheet. Specifically, they ask, should we provide information that both partnership organizations, specifically the political subdivision and the service provider, are managing, or does it mean providing some type of financial projections of what the business expense revenue would be for the project locations that will be built with these grant funds?
So that's a long question, and you take that out. So I was like, I'm trying to listen, but that was good. It's a very good question. We've had a lot about what to include in the pro forma, and more is better. Inundated is not. If you've got, you know, we don't want the whole municipal budget by any means. We want the project budget. But we also have to have proof that the project is going to be successful if funded. So just keep it that way. We did not put specifics about what to put in the pro forma and in the budget, but more is better. Too much is not. That makes sense. Jennifer, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, and I think you know, that's exactly right, Catherine. I think, you know, when you're, you know, you want to focus on you know, the evaluation criteria as well when you're determining what information to provide. Yeah. I mean, put yourselves in the place of a reviewer looking at your application. Some of the evaluation criteria that reviewers will be looking at include applicants, organizational capability, you know, the reasonableness of the budget, the sustainability of the project. And so the financial information that you want to provide, you want to gear those toward the evaluation criteria and the NOFO to make sure that you're providing sufficient information that a reviewer can assess that, yes, both this lead applicant and then the fixed broadband service provider, there's, you know, a going concern, it's financially stable, it has resources to undertake and complete the project. You know, and the project is going to be sustainable, it's going to be generating revenue. I mean, so these are all the things that a reviewer is going to be focused on when they look at your application. So you want to make sure that you provide sufficient information for a reviewer to assess that.
Great, thank you. All right, Jennifer, another question, because I know you are our point of contact for EHP. So how should we approach environmental impact costs that arise during construction after award funding? So for example, right now, this potential applicant has a statement saying that they will comply with the requirements and any unexpected costs will be covered by the county. Is that sufficient? Or does the applicant need to factor environmental costs into contingency funds?
I mean, you can definitely factor that into contingency funds. I mean, or contingency costs, that there'll be, you know, that there may be unanticipated costs associated with environmental compliance. We don't expect an applicant to have all their environmental approvals and permits in place before at the time of application. There will be a period where we will be conducting an environmental review. You know, we'll most likely impose a specific award condition on the award to make sure that the environmental is complete before we issue or release funds to perform construction activities. So, and then there's always an opportunity to amend budgets once they're approved, once you're awarded, and as you experience additional costs, there is an opportunity to amend the budget accordingly. Ming, do you want to add anything else on that front from a grants office perspective?
Actually, what's that question again? I'm sorry.
Oh, it's about the environmental and where to factor costs in for that. If you don't have anything, I just thought if you wanted to weigh in on some of the budget discussion.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have additional to add to that.
That's okay.
So I have seen a couple of questions come in, and I'm going to take this, give the moderators, not that I'm the moderator, give the panelists a quick break. It's been a long week, guys. In regards to the application, regarding the eligible service area, and if folks have lists of census blocks or images of area maps, Google Earth images, etc., they're wondering if they have to be included in the page count or they could be attached as separate addendums. And they can be attached as separate addendums and excluded from the page count. Right, Jennifer? I'm not.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. All right. So Ming, we have a question about indirect costs. If the lead applicant will be relying on the fixed broadband provider as a subrecipient, are both entities' administrative costs direct, the lead applicant does not have an indirect cost rate, eligible for inclusion in the budget? Are there limitations in the total amount? Wait a second.
That's a question.
Go ahead. No, sorry.
So generally, if you're including indirect costs to the budget, you will need to provide either you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, or use the certification that from the state. In most cases, from the state, that if you're over 35 million, receive over $35 million of federal funds, then you would require to negotiate a proposal. So if you don't have an indirect cost rate and there is no, I guess, a specific line for indirect cost, that's where the administrative cost line would be the appropriate line to include the indirect cost, whether it's the lead applicant or in this case here the fixed broadband partner as a subrecipient. You will be included in their section there. There's no, there's 424C, there's no construction or sub-award line of the form where you can put it. So that's where probably the most appropriate line to include the cost. The important thing is that, detailed budget needs to be itemized and detail justify all costs within the cost category. The answer to that question is that there's no limit for administrative costs for the program. So as long as it's necessary and justified, that would be sufficient.
Thank you, Ming. Okay, here's a tricky question. I think, Jennifer, we've had some of this come up in the FAQs, but this is a little bit different. They're saying if a political subdivision wins an NTIA broadband infrastructure grant listing a covered partnership, do they still have to place bids for every service cited in the grant? How are the partners that they listed guaranteed they get to work with the project if the company wins the bid?
I think for purposes of the application, they just need to identify the fixed broadband service provider, and we're leaving it up to the political subdivision to put the steps in place to, to what they need to do on their ends to make sure that they follow their procurement requirements in terms of getting the collaborators and other project, participants involved in the project. So just for our purposes, we just need to understand who the fixed broadband service provider is going to be, just name it in the application, and then provide a letter of commitment. But any kind of other formal agreement or procurement that needs to go through, that's up to the political subdivision.
Great, thank you. Catherine.
Yes.
If there is a consortium that is in the covered partnership that includes a county, a city, and a broadband provider, can the city be the primary / lead applicant?
Yes. I like Susanna always gives me questions that are yes
Well,
or no.
this one gets a little trickier. I don't know
It
if this
does.
one was associated with it, but the next one gets a little trickier. But
Okay, yes, the lead applicant has to be the governmental entity. If it's a consortium and you've signed the consortium agreements and everybody's okay with it, then it can be either the city or the county, whoever is going to take the lead.
Great.
I imagine that's the case in quite a few because a lot of cities have more capacity than counties do.
So here's another follow-up question. Can non-contiguous political subdivisions be in a single consortium?
Yes.
So that these subdivisions are not next to each other in the state, but they may be in different counties. So that's good.
Right.
Okay.
And you'll have that, and you just have to identify your unserved areas and and if you have one fixed broadband provider as your partner, yes, they can be on two separate sides of the state. They can, yes, as long as you have an agreement in place.
Yeah, there's no requirement that the proposed service areas be contiguous. They can identify several, and they can be, anywhere within the area, that under which this political subdivision has control, whether it's the city, county, or the state.
Yep.
Right. And you could have multiple service providers be partners, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So here's another question, Jennifer or Catherine. When designing a last mile fiber project for the proposed service area, can the last mile be to the curb for each passing household in the project area, or does it have to actually go up to the actual dwelling unit?
I mean, well, we're trying to ensure that, our first priority is to connect unserved households. So that's not to say that wouldn't be something that a project we wouldn't allow, but I mean, our priority for the program is to connect unserved households. So
and if they're doing that in the narrative, I would think what they would need to do is explain how that connection to the house was going to happen. Like if it's another program that you're partnering with, maybe the provider has one or the city is going to underwrite it or something. But I think that connection, because it's really number of households that are going to be served. And if you just take it to the street, to the driveway, you need to explain more.
Yeah, I think that. So like I said, we wouldn't outright say no, but you can do it. But I think we just need to understand what the plan is and what the plan would be for connecting unserved households.
Right. All right, this is a tricky question. I'm not sure that the context is, but Ming, I'm going to throw it at you because it has to do with the standard forms.
Because it's tricky. It's not yes, no.
No, it's the forms. I got a question here. What do we attach in section 14 for the project area details?
Section 14 of what form?
I don't know. We don't have that context. All right.
So what we attach in section 14 for detailed project area? I'm not sure what that means in the, I'm not sure if I answered the question correctly.
Are they talking about
section 14 of the
SF 424, which is the areas affected by the project? So I think Natalie went over that in her presentation. She said, you could add attachments of the map or whatever the proposed service area is. It's not required, but it's, recommended or appreciated.
Okay.
Any-
So yeah, I mean, I think that's section 14. I guess, I mean, for section 15, that's where you attach the budget narrative and budget justification per the instruction of the NOFO. But for for section 14, I think now we went through that, if that's what was the question. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, the line 14 is areas affected by the project, and then description title, number 15, and then then you right after that is the attachment button to attach all the attachments.
Okay. Here's a question. Is real estate considered in-kind costs? For example, a school district is providing space on its property for building a tower. Would that space be considered in kind?
Yeah, if it was going to be contributed, the space was going to be contributed to the project, then it could be considered a match, an in-kind match.
Oh, we've got another question about pages. Everyone wants to write a lot for this grant. And I think I know the answer, but I'm going to defer to Jennifer and Catherine and Ming. Are only the pages with text explanation required to be numbered? So I'm assuming these are the pictures that, you know, pictures of the service areas or pictures of maps or even the list of census blocks they're probably talking about.
Yeah, I mean, because there's only the page limit is associated with the project narrative, so that would be, we need a page numbering for that. But any other attachment, there's not a page limit requirement for those. So I mean, if it's easier to understand, I mean, you can certainly number your pages of the attachments so we know if they're supposed to be in a specific order. Yes, number them, but it's not necessarily a requirement.
Okay. So now I'm going to start digging into some of the questions that have been popping up while we've been doing the Q&A. So bear with me, folks, as I kind of go through them. Here's a question about items having to be in trust per page 37 of the NOFO. Do electronic equipment purchased for $25,000 have to be put into trust?
So what page of the NOFO is that about just the property disposition requirements?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, anything that you purchase with grant funds, there's a federal interest that's attached to it. So anything that's greater with a unit cost greater than $5,000, if it's a piece of equipment, then the federal interest would attach to that. So what that means is that there are certain use and disposition requirements that apply. So the asset needs to be used for the purpose of the project. If at any time it's no longer used or useful, you would need to come in and get approval from Ntia and this grants office to dispose or sell of the asset. But so if it's a piece of equipment and the unit cost is more than $5,000, then yes, there's a federal interest in those assets if they were purchased with grant funds.
Thank you. This is a question for Ming. This is a common question. I know he answered it yesterday on the webinar. If awarded, does the money go to the applicant in one lump sum or in advance?
Thank you for that question. So the answer to that question is there will be, if the application is selected for award, there will be specific award conditions to the award. So unless otherwise stated in the specific award conditions, advance payment will be made, will be authorized to a nonprofit entity, and also the funds will be made available, basically pre-authorized to the automatic standard application system, which is a ASAP payment system, where the nonprofit entity have access to draw down funds as needed to cover the costs for the project. However, the prime recipient is the only one that will have access to the federal drawdown federal funds from the ASAP system. In that connection, the prime recipient will be responsible for reviewing the subrecipient and vendors' invoices and make payments to the subrecipient or vendors. So the award will be made pre-authorized to ASAP, and the funds can be drawn down as needed basis through ASAP system.
Okay, great. have a couple questions about, and I think I've got to answer this. Jennifer, tell me if I'm wrong. Someone wants to know if they can submit the budget Excel justification in landscape format. I don't see why not, as long as it's an 8.5 by 11 document, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And then Ming, you're very familiar with grants.gov, but I also want to share with everyone that grants.gov has fantastic training online, a really helpful help desk that's staffed 24 hours. So if you have some questions about some of the forms or the actual application that you are using to fill out the application for this grant program, definitely look at grants.gov for a lot of those questions to be answered too. But we do have a question here, Ming.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Susan, I'll just add, like if you're, we do get a couple of questions, and if you're experiencing problems, like if you can't access the opportunity, I mean, it's set up that you can apply to this grant opportunity. If you're having problems with that, contact the help desk on grants.gov. This is not an NTIA system. We know, we've tested it. We know that you should be able to go on and submit your application package right now. And if you're having issues, I would contact the grants.gov help desk.
Great, thanks you.
I mean, just to add to Jennifer, like I said, I know that we have been getting a lot of questions regarding, they're not able to upload some of the forms or to the grants.gov portal. So there was a instruction in the NOFO, basically it's on top, bottom page of 16 and top page of 17 of the NOFO, where you address some of the questions regarding attaching other documents, budget narrative, and budgets to the application. It is actually attached. We are this SF424 line 15, like I mentioned earlier. If you click on that attachment, and you should be able to open up a zip file. That's where you upload the documents for the budget narrative, justification, and other documentations to support the proposal.
So that is actually dovetails perfectly to another question we got in regards to uploading attachments. So one of the potential applicants wants to know if they can upload the attachments one at a time, or do they have to wait until they have completed all of them to upload them?
I believe you can actually, you mean upload attached to the 424, right?
I believe so, yeah. That's the only area that you can do uploads, yeah.
Right, so if you attach additional documentation to the SF424, you can actually upload one at a time or upload it all at one time. So once you click attachment, you should be able to add, delete, or remove, the ones you don't need, and you can re-upload the ones you need in there.
Okay. Here's another question. Does a subcontract bid have to be broken down in the budget worksheet?
Is it a subcontract bid?
Yes, so they're probably thinking the details of that actual bid in the subcontract, so I'm saying, I'm assuming that they have a bid to, trench and pull fiber through a conduit, right? Do they have to have those costs broken down? Like what's the trenching part, what's the conduit piece, and what's the blowing fiber piece, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it would be helpful to know that as we're going through, make sure that the activities and the costs are allowable.
Okay. So here's another question. I think, Catherine, you talked a little bit about this in the FAQs, but it is a good question. And I think Catherine and Ming might be able to help here. Somebody's worried that what if they find out their attachments aren't accepted days after they submit their application on H817?
Ming, correct me if I'm wrong, but we would contact the applicant as soon as we do the initial evaluation, initial review that I mentioned, and say, something must have happened. Your attachments weren't uploaded. Can you please go back and upload them? Or yes, we would cure that by reaching out to them. So don't worry about it if technology sometimes isn't always 100%, as we know.
But there is a time frame for that, right?
It's 7 days. Okay. 7 days. So once we reach out to you, you have 7 days to get the information to us.
Yeah, so that generally pertaining for non-substantive, information that is easily cured or rectified during the the submission process. If the document required in the NOFO that is not incomplete, there may not be unless it's a non-sensitive information that we require to review the proposal.
But we would contact them, Ming, and say,
Right.
we didn't get this. Did you mean
So we
not to
strongly
submit this?
encourage-
Yes.
Yeah, we strongly encourage to check, your application package, make sure all the required forms, all the required
Yes.
documentations are attached before you submit.
All right. All right, here's a tricky question, Jennifer. This has to do with potential overbuild. So another carrier has an existing middle mile in the project area, but it's long haul transport only. Can we use this grant to overbuild the middle mile and provide services to the end user?
I think, we'll have to, evaluate that, to, once we get it, to make sure, we have an obligation not to duplicate funding. So I think we just need to, it's hard to say one way or the other just from this, from a hypothetical, but we need to understand what the nature of the overbuild was, with what current speeds are being provided versus what would be provided under this new proposal. So, it's not something we would reject outright, but we would need to do a little bit more, evaluation of what the proposed build was and what the contemplated overbuild would be, to make sure that we're not duplicating federal funding and we're not duplicating costs that are paid for with another federal fund.
Okay. Catherine, if a municipality is an ISP that's offering high-speed broadband, can they go for this grant without a partnership?
They would have a partnership. The city would have to be the lead applicant. So the city is the lead applicant, then the ISP, which is usually a subset of the city, would be the internet service provider. So it would still be considered a partnership that way. So it's just kind of bifurcating the two, which I'm sure in the city finances and everything, it is separate too. So.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I have a long question here. Okay. The census block information for our affected project area downloaded from the Ntia Indicators of Broadband Need Map does not show actual speeds, but rather advertised speeds. The census tract information for the same area, which should include the affected census blocks, shows a median speed well below 25.3. Will that suffice to meet the definition of an eligible service area?
Definitely provide that information in your application. As Catherine mentioned, during the programmatic review, we will also be validating that information against information that we have in our National Broadband Availability Map, which has a little bit more data, in fact, a lot more data layers than what you would be seeing in the Indicators of Broadband Need Map that we've made publicly available. So provide that information, any other additional information that you have to substantiate the claim that the area is unserved, and we will also do our own validation using the tools that we have available.
All right. So Jennifer, here's another question, and I'm pretty sure we addressed it in the FAQs, but I think it's kind of tricky in terms, and this has to do with the FCC RDOF program. Specifically, the applicant says some small portions of the project area may have received federal monies through the RDOF program. However, no work has begun, and we do not know what work, if any, will be done. How does that affect our application in these areas?
Well, we're prioritizing unserved locations, and the definition of unserved is that the area lacks access to qualifying broadband service, and no other broadband provider is receiving federal or state support or been selected to receive. So if the area has received RDOF funding, that's not just precluded outright, but it just means that we need to do additional research, digging into what exactly has been served, what's the timing of that deployment. And we have our weekly coordination meetings with the FCC and USDA, so we will be endeavoring to make sure that we're not duplicating funding that these agencies, the FCC or RUS, are already committed to funding. So it's something that we'll need to take a closer look at to make sure that those particular areas would be eligible for funding under our program.
All right. So what if the state does not want to participate in the program? Is the broadband provider allowed to apply on their own? And I know that answer is no, but Catherine, what are some other opportunities for them? Should they work with other localities or?
You're supposed to let me say no, because I only do yes or no questions. Yes, I would encourage, if the state does not want to be your partner on the covered partnership, then reach out to the county, reach out to the city, reach out if there's a regional planning commission, anything that's an instrumentality of the state, which varies from state to state. So you might need to look into that, but reach out to any other government entity and see in that covered area, in that area that you're going to apply for. So it doesn't have to be the state.
But you do need a governmental entity.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, I didn't finish that, but it has to be a covered partnership, and the lead applicant has to be a kind of, it has been a really long week, and the lead applicant has to be that government entity. So you need to make sure that when you're talking to them, to let them know that they would have to be the lead entity.
Okay. Ming, here's a grants question for you about the SF424 suite of forms. If there is a third party writing and administering this grant, is it included in the administrative area of the SF424C budget form, or should there be an SF424B attached for that portion of the budget?
I think there is a pre-application cost allow up to 50,000, I believe, in the NOFO, where only if your award is selected and awarded, and you are basically reimbursed for that cost. If the award is not, made, or so your application is not selected, it's not made, then basically you're at your own risk incurring pre-award costs. So to answer that question, that cost can be included in the administrative costs here. The 424C section C, but the justification has to be included in your budget narrative, explaining the cost of each item included in the category.
Great. Here's a question about indirect cost rates, so I'm going to throw it at Ming again. Local governments that don't receive funding in excess of 35 million are not required to negotiate an indirect cost rate. If said local government submits a certificate of indirect cost rate, would that suffice?
Yes. So for a state or for government entity, if you do not receive 35 million federal funds, you are not required to provide a negotiated rate proposal. So you would submit a certification to justify the indirect cost rate you're charging to the award, and explain how it's calculated based on the base of the modified total direct cost base.
Okay. I know, Jennifer, this is something that you've seen in other grant programs you've worked on, but I think this is still something that we should share with folks. We got a question about, are applicants able to mark confidential any budget details in their budget narrative and or detailed budget justification that they provide, since this would be a highly sensitive business information?
Well, we don't make the application materials as a whole public. The only thing that we would the executive summary, that would be that you submit as part of your application. That will be public. All the other materials that we have are not made public, but anything that you want to highlight as confidential, you may do so. The NOFO has a provision, I think it's, I forget what section, but there is a provision that talks about confidential business information and to designate that as such.
All right, we've got another question about in-kind match. If the service provider owns poles on which the fiber will be strung, could that be considered as an in-kind contribution?
Yes.
All right. Oh, this is a tough one. I don't know if this falls into contingencies or not, but you tell me. how do we account for unknown inflationary costs? For example, we have an estimate now, but the bid ends up coming in 10 to 15% higher.
Yeah, and that's where you would put in the contingency costs in line item 13 of the SF 424C. As we mentioned yesterday, we do have a FAQ in the works talking about the contingency costs and and how to look at them. The general percentage that NTIA we're looking in concert with our sister agency, the Economic Development Administration, is to roughly use an estimate of 10 to 15% for contingency costs. But we'll explain that in the FAQ that we will hopefully get cleared this week, and we'll post it to the website.
All right, I've got one last question. I'm going to give it to Catherine. If the ISP is an entity of the city, is a partnership required, being that we are a department of the city?
Yes. I'm looking at Jennifer too, because she's got, but I like my yes, no. It has to be a covered partnership.
Yeah, so we do address that in our FAQs. And so, the concept of a partnership means two different entities. So, if you are a municipality and you have your own broadband service provider unit of the government, you still need another entity to form the covered partnership. That's not to say that your own entity can't participate in the project and help with it, but in order to form a covered partnership, we need two different entities: a governmental entity, the state, political subdivision, and a fixed broadband service provider, and the two are not affiliated with each other. And I think that we have an FAQ on that in our second set of FAQ, or third set that is posted on the website. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Catherine.
I don't.
They're all blending in together.
They do.
Okay, another question snuck in, and this is important because a lot of people are really worried that the 1 year period of performance just is not enough time. So the question is, you stated on line 17 of the 424 to put the project start date and end date as a 1 year period of performance. If you know your project is going to take more than 1 year to complete, do you complete your project plan with the number of years you know it will take to complete the project, or do you make the project fit within the 1 year time period?
So right now, and this is because obviously we know that a construction project is not going to be complete in 1 year. The reason we had to give 1 year is because it's in the statute that funds must be expended within 1 year. So right now, everyone has a 1 year period of performance, an award period. If you know your project will not be completed, then you can request an extension from the assistant secretary, and the statute in the NOFO lays out the elements of this extension request. You need to say that construction project's underway, you have a plan for the use of the funds, extenuating circumstances, prevent you from completing this project within 1 year. So your budget should still use costs associated with a 1 year award period, because that's all you have right now. I would put in your extension request, explain how much additional time you're going to need, and explain, like, if it's another 2 years, explain that in the extension request. We allow that to be submitted with the application. But right now, we just everyone has a 1 year award period. And so you should structure your budget that way. But in your extension request, you can describe how long it's really going to take, and to construct the project, and what you envision, how many more years you're going to take, and how you envision costs being allocated over that time period.
Thanks, Jennifer. So, go ahead, Catherine.
Not on this question. I have a follow-up to the municipal question.
Okay.
I didn't get to do my pitch, that if this program, because it is only $288 million, we imagine it's going to be oversubscribed by a substantial amount. So if this program does not work for you as the municipality and the municipal broadband provider, there is other money out there. There's the Treasury, state and local fiscal relief funding that a lot of states and localities are using for broadband. So contact your state. There is also money in the capital projects fund of the American Rescue Plan that Treasury is administering, that money is going to go directly to states, and they should be having, I think they said this summer, so it's still summer. They'll put out the guidance on that, and that money also goes directly to states. So I encourage you, if this program doesn't work for you, or if you don't get funded, to contact your state and talk to them about your project.
A great point. Thank you, Catherine. So we're just hitting up at 4 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us. Please see those links that I posted in the chat. One of them is to the state broadband points of contact that Catherine was talking about. Other is to the web page for the Broadband Infrastructure Program that has all the FAQs, past webinars that are posted. And within the next week, we will post a copy of the presentation materials, the transcript, and a video if you want to watch us all perform again. But thank you so much for participating. And if we didn't address your questions, we will be working our hardest to get them included in FAQs that will be released over the next week or so. But thank you again and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.